Hi there, I'm Carl, and today I'm going to take you through the process that I went through to paint this Dreadscythe Harridan for Age of Sigmar. This is my Nighthaunt army, so I take a little bit of more time to paint these guys up. And there's a lot of really fun basics that we're going to go and kind of go over. Things like how to paint nice, clean, smooth white that's not chalky. Things like how to mix paints, how to edge highlight correctly. How to do mixing of paint properly, the right consistency to get good coverage. So, a lot of people, they talk about, you want to thin your paints. I'm going to teach you how you should thin your paints, how far you should thin your paints. I'm going to be teaching you how to properly wash something that's this delicate and with this much surface area. A lot of the times people tend to have a hard time washing cloaks and getting even responses from that. I'm going to show you how to thin your washes. So you can build up washes gradually and carefully. There's a lot of stuff to learn in this video. So we're going to start with building up this white base coat here. And to do that, I'm going to be using sponges, and I'm going to be using these miniatures that have been primed this nice medium gray. So the trick to painting white is to actually build up grays. I'm also going to be batch painting today, so I've got a few of these other ladies that I'm going to be going through as well. All right, so the first color I'm going to start off with is Stonewall Grey, and I need to thin this down so it applies nicely. The thing about thinning paints, though, is that essentially what you're doing is really, you're just modifying the ratio inside there, because there's already water in your paint. It's used as a solvent to keep the acrylic from drying. By adding more water, all we're really doing is managing the ratios of acrylic medium, which is what acrylic paint actually is, the pigment, and the water, which is the thing that's keeping it wet. As far as I know, that's my layman's understanding of how paint works. So the practical understanding of how paint works is that I need to add water to this to actually make it flow nicely. So let's get started. I have a nice little pipette here to be able to control how many drops of water I want. And I'm going to add 1-2 drops there because I've got quite a bit of paint here. And I'm going to use the back of my brush to work this in. And I'm going to see how it beads. And I think this is beading quite nicely. So I'm going to give this a shot. And if it's too thick and it doesn't cover quite well, I can always just wipe it off the miniature because I have nice dry primer here that it's not going to be damaged if I just wipe it off with a sponge. So to start painting, I'm going to take my makeup sponge and I'm going to give it a good slice down the middle to make it a more manageable size. And I'm going to be using this entire flat of this makeup sponge in order to work this. I'm also going to save this because I can cut it in half later and also use that as well. So to load my sponge, I'm just going to come in and dab some of this here. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to try to avoid getting any other droplets of water involved in here, because that's going to mess up the ratio of water to paint on the sponge, which is going to make it harder for us to paint with. Maybe give it a few test stamps. Quite heavy, but looking okay. And now I can start working the gray paint up on the model here. By repeatedly going over areas like I am here, I'm smoothing out this paint, so I'm not introducing too much texture to it, which is something natural that's going to happen with the sponge because it has a texture to it. By basically alternating my stamping methods, I'm not only moving paint around, I'm also mitigating any kind of texture buildup. So for areas that are difficult to reach, I like to go get my tweezers and use those, and sometimes even a smaller sponge than what I've got here, to get into like hard to reach areas. You might see me using these quite a bit during this video. It also makes holding the sponge a little less tiresome on your fingers. So these are good investments if you're going to be using this technique. All right, so I finished my first layer of Stonewall Grey, and I really only have to do one, I believe. This looks pretty even and nice. And you're going to see some areas of natural shadow kind of in here and in here, for example, where the sponge, because it physically can't actually contact into those points, it rides on top of it and acts like a dry brush. But the dry brush technique here, or the dry sponging technique, more or less, is far more smooth than any kind of dry brush I've ever used before. So the extra texture of a dry brush has streaks in it, okay? So by using the sponge to do a similar technique, we can blend the paint a little bit better. Whereas if I do a heavier dry brush here, I really load this brush up with paint, and I try to do a similar effect, you can see this one is okay, but not as even as this one. We're going to move on to the next color in our color lineup right after I do all of these ladies too. All right, so the first layer of Stonewall Grey is looking pretty solid, and I'm happy with how it's turned out in all the miniatures. And next I'm going to step up for my next color, which is Ghost Grey, and I'm going to mix it to a similar consistency as the previous Stonewall Grey. If you find an area that's a little rough or you've put a little too much paint on, you can always swap over to the side of your sponge and kind of mop that paint up and redistribute it, kind of tamping down and smoothing out your blend. You may have noticed that while I'm doing this, I'm kind of focusing on the top of the miniature more than the bottom or the recesses within its cloak and its kind of folds, because I want those places to be darker to kind of naturally enhance the shadows this guy is going to have. All right, so to get this nice blue-green, I'm going to mix together two colors. I'm going to mix together emerald, model color emerald, and model color Prussian blue. And they're going to be a 50-50% mix. 50-50 by volume, by size of the drop on the actual palette. So there's our Prussian blue, and here is our emerald. There we go. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add more or less an equal size drop to one of these. So we're going to do a 1-to-1-to-1 mix of water, paint, and both of my paints here. And we're going to give that a good mix. The reason why I didn't go equal parts water to paint is because both of these paints are quite liquidy to start off with. And if I draw them out, and the way that it's beading on my wet palette, I know this is a fairly decent paint. It'll cover fairly well. And if you add too much water to something, like I'll put down a little bit of this paint here, and I'll add way too much water to it, and we mix it together, if you pull it out and it immediately flows back in on itself or it beads into droplets, then you know you've gone too far, more or less. You've put way too much water in. And you need to go and either add a bunch more paint to this mix to thicken it back up, or you can add a little bit of matte medium, which is essentially clear, non-pigmented paint, to your paint in order to kind of bring back some of the viscosity. Put a big old drop of that in there. Now if I draw this out, you can see it's almost too thick. So add a little bit more water to that and just gradually work this up. Now if I pull this out, it's okay. I can probably work with that. And in a lot of ways, that's what you're looking for when you're mixing paints, is I can work with that. I can probably make that work. Remember also that your brush carries moisture on it as well. So depending on how much you've loaded your brush up with moisture, you're actually changing the consistency of your paint itself, which is why having a paper towel around to wipe your brush on, like when you see me wiping my brush, it's not just me getting the paint off after I've rinsed my brush, it's me managing the dryness, the amount of hydration I have on the tip of my brush. Because if you have a really wet brush and you try to load it with paint, you're introducing water to your blend. And in this case, because I added so much matte medium or clear paint to this, when I come in and I try to paint with it, I'm actually glazing. I'm doing what's called making a glaze, which is a very thin, transparent paint, which can be used to tint surfaces, and I do use that technique quite a bit. This is effectively a wash. If I come in here and I actually add a lot of water to this, we have what is effectively a wash. So you can see how it runs in, it doesn't stay on the raised areas, it runs into all the creases, right? So this is what effectively a wash is. It's just a transparent paint that's very liquid. So you can make your own washes with your own paints if you really want to. In the context of this, what I've got over here, we'll give this a shot on my hand, and we can see that this pre-mixed paint here that I felt was pretty good, it paints beautifully, but it's also semi-transparent because of how I've mixed it and my application, how much I've loaded it on my brush. So when I go back over on my miniatures, I'm actually going to be able to retain some of that shadow, because some of the shadow is actually going to artificially darken down the area that I'm painting, which is what I'm going to get to right now. So I've blocked in the blue-green on my batch here that I'm batch painting, but it's not as snug to like her cloak and a few other areas that I'd like, little detail areas. So I'm going to come in with a smaller brush and do those details real quick. Okay, so while I'm waiting for this kind of blue-green area to fully cure, I'm gonna do the hair up here, and that's also another mix. So it's time for me to bring my palette over here to show you guys what's up. So this mix is going to be Prussian blue and this gray, this Basalt gray. And it's gonna be another 50-50 mix, just like the Emerald Prussian blue mix that we did earlier. So I'm gonna give these both a good shake, and we're gonna get mixing. So this hair here with this particular mix of paint that I've done earlier is a good example of how paint should behave. Properly thinned paint flows into recesses, but also doesn't kind of retreat from raised areas. Okay, so to get started on our blend here, what we're going to need to do is have a nice fresh sponge. This is what I've got here. And we're going to need to load it up with paint. In this case, we're going to be using white paint, and that's how it's going to go on top of this nice teal here, or I guess you would call it blue-green would be a more accurate description. And I'm going to load this up quite lightly, and there's one of two techniques we can use. We can use a similar technique to what we use to do base coating, which is to tap the paint in, and to very lightly tap it in so that it rides on top, and that'll build us gradual amounts of color. And the other technique is to kind of drag this across like so, almost like a dry brush. And naturally, as we kind of do this in very, very many repeated attempts, we're going to build up color almost like a dry brush, because we're going to be letting the sponge ride across the surface. And what we're looking to do here is to gradually build up our color. And that will get us this kind of nice ice blue transition, which is what we're looking for. We've already kind of seen that showing up on this miniature here. If it looks too intense, it's probably because the white paint hasn't completely dried yet. So just give it some time. If you've gone too far and you feel like you've brightened up an area too much, we can always come in and bring in a little bit of our teal back into the mix here. Just come in here and put a nice layer on there. And then when I come back over that later with my sponge blend, I will be able to tidy that up a little bit more and refine my blend a bit. Remember when you're working with sponge blending techniques that you can build up a lot of texture unintentionally if you are pushing too hard or using too thick of a paint. A way around that, well, one is to thin your paints properly and make sure they're nice and liquid. And the other way is to make sure that when you are finished kind of layering and stamping in the paint in an area, just give it a little bit of a rub, kind of spread that paint out a little bit. And what that'll do is it'll take any raised areas and kind of work them out naturally through just kind of spreading them out a little bit. Alright, so I'm done with the cloak blends, and I'm going to move on to doing the hair detail, but before that I need to do a little bit of cleanup work on the hair, because unfortunately some of that white paint got in there while I was doing the blending. Once we're done that, I'm going to mix up a nice highlight tone, and we're going to go over the top and kind of sides of this lady's hair and kind of sketch in some highlights. Alright, so I've got my palette back here, and I'm going to mix up my blue-gray with some white to create a highlight color. I'm going to use the tip of this guy here and just kind of drag my blue and my gray and my white together. And that looks like a pretty decent shade right in there. I don't need a lot of this paint, this highlight paint that I'm making, because it's going to be a very, very subtle effect. So the trick to doing edge highlighting is to use a fairly dry brush and a fairly dry mix of paint. If your brush gets a little too wet during the kind of rinsing and reapplication process, the reloading process, just dry it off on a paper towel, clean brush, dry that off, and then reload it with your paint and just come back in and sketch that in. All right, for the roses in their hair, I'm going to use a little flat red as the base coat. I'm going to put 2 thin coats on there, fairly well hydrated, of a paint mix so that it flows into all the recesses. And then after that, I'm going to do quite a thick mix of white and red to create a pink, and that's going to be used as the highlight color to put the kind of top coat on the roses. Just to show you what the pink mix is going to look like, I'm going to grab a bunch of paint from over here at the end of my my brush so as not to ruin the bristles by overloading it with paint. And I'm just going to mix it until I got a pink that I feel looks nice, which I think this is going to be quite lovely here. And if you're curious what you would use to highlight red to make it feel like a brighter red instead of white, you actually use brighter oranges. The final detail in the hair are the vines, which are actually quite difficult to see. And to kind of differentiate them a little bit, I'm going to pick them out with some flat green. And the mix of this flat green is going to be fairly dry. I don't want to overhydrate this paint, because if I do, it will make my life harder because it'll want to flow into all the recesses. So we're looking at a fairly thick paint. So for these vines, I'm going to do a bit of a highlight using the same technique that I used for the hair and the roses, which is to mix a little bit of white in with this green. Okay, so the hair is done and I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. The next thing I'm going to do is the scythe hands, and for that I'm going to be using some Model Air Metallic Black. Just a reminder, guys, that you should always use a different cup of water to rinse your brushes when you're working with metallics. The reason being that metallic flake can actually work its way into your paint through your brush. So you could be painting like a nice red or a nice orange and actually have silver flakes in it. Okay, so while the paint on these scythes is drying, I'm going to do these gold rings, and I'm going to knock those out with a little bit of Scale 75 Necro Gold. If you guys are familiar with my tribulations with gold in my last video, that was quite a challenge. This stuff just works, so it takes one coat and it's done. Alright, so the gold is nice and done, and the black is dry, so I'm going to go and do the edge highlighting to make those pop. And I'm going to use some heavy metal from Scale 75. This is a silver-like color, or like a bright, very bright gunmetal. Going to come in here and just roughly sketch in the edge detail to kind of give this a little bit more shape and life. Alright, so the last metallic detail on all these miniatures is going to be this metallic kind of fence that's sticking up out of the ground here. And I'm going to use Scale 75 decayed metal, which is like a really nice dark brown metal for that. It's going to look kind of like metal wrought iron. So just to finish off the fences, I'm going to use a little bit of this Vallejo Mecha Color rust texture. This is a technical paint. It's very gritty looking. What that's going to do is it's just going to like knock down all that shine that the metallic has and give the entire thing more of a ambiance of decay. Okay, so I'm finished with all of the details on these ladies. The only thing that I really have left to do is give them that wash that I mentioned earlier. So we're going to mix up a custom wash for these ladies, and we want it to be very subtle, so we're actually going to be thinning it like I kind of demonstrated earlier in the video. So I'm going to grab some of my Army Painter Dark Tone, and this is essentially a black wash, but it's actually quite a thin black wash. And I'm just going to put a bunch of it down. We might even end up running out of this, so we might have to mix a little bit more. Then I'm going to grab my matte medium, and I'm going to put more or less equal parts tone to medium. And then I'm going to grab some water here, and I'm going to put in a bit. All right, so I have my wash here that I've mixed up. It's 50% dark tone, 50% matte medium, and a little bit of water to get it to more or less this consistency here. As you can see how it's kind of beading, but it's also staying in the same place. I want it to bead like that because if it's doing that, it's flowing correctly, and the surface tension will draw the wash into recesses if it's got a nice bead to it. If it's too thick, it'll act like a glaze and it'll just stay where you brush. If it's nice and thin like this is, when you brush it down, it'll actually get sucked into the recesses of the hairs, but not stay on the top as much. And that will allow it to basically live in the recesses and help define the shadows. And because we thinned it down, we're not going to kill detail if it is on the kind of top a little bit by like kind of knocking down the color by darkening it down with a dark tone. All right, so this is way too much wash. If you've added too much wash on this, just wet your brush, clean it out, a little bit of water, and just lift that wash up. And when we're washing like this, you're gonna find that this kind of very thin, transparent wash is going to flow into places. Like if I put a little wash there, it's gonna wanna flow down here and pool over there. So we need to be very careful when we're washing about, observing where the wash ends up. Because where we decide to put it with this kind of consistency of wash doesn't mean it's going to stay where we put it. It will travel down with the path of gravity and settle in recesses that we may not be wanting wash to be in. So in that case, what we're going to do is we're going to apply our wash and then wait until we see things like this pool right here. And then we're going to clean our brush up, and with a little bit of extra water, we're just going to come in and touch that up and just clean that kind of pool up. And if we do our job quickly enough before the wash has time to set, we won't get any coffee ringing or staining, but we will be able to get a nice overall kind of glaze wash into places like this, which will knock down the color and the intensity and kind of smooth out these transitions. All right, so the wash is fully cured, and what I've done to kind of tidy it up a little bit is any areas where I found there was kind of blotchy coffee ringing or coffee staining on the white robes, very, very subtle stuff, because what we were doing is a very subtle wash. I've just come in and layered on a little bit of white paint to erase those. And then beyond that, the only other thing I've done is a little bit of edge highlighting on these kind of top robes and on their arms, which are heavily washed. And this kind of helps define the white that we have and give it some body and some shape. Because pure white, obviously doesn't have a lot of shadows in it. So with the subtle wash that we've done, we've created like a nice kind of subtle gradient, and then we've come in and kind of put a nice hot highlight in there to really push the contrast in those regions. And that I think looks quite nice and allows it to be quite eye-catching when it's on tabletop. The last color I'm going to use on the model itself before I do the base is a little bit of Elven Gold, scale 75 Elven Gold. And that's just going to get touched onto the armbands because they've been washed down. They're quite dark now, even after the Necro Gold, which is quite a dark gold. The armbands have been kind of pushed even darker through the wash. And I want to add some pop to them. And a little bit of Elven Gold, a bit of a bright gold is just what the doctor ordered to get this accomplished. So one of the last things that I'm going to do here before I call it quits is just tidy up the hair a little bit. I want to push just a little bit of more intensity into these highlights. So I'm going to come back in And using the same color, more or less, that I did those first green highlights, I'm going to come in and kind of tidy up and punch up the green highlights in the vines in the hair. Just to finish up the hair here, I'm going to add some very hot highlights. And this is just essentially the same gray paint that I've been using and mixing up, and I've just mixed a little bit more white into it. And that's going to give us these nice, really hot highlights that are going to really pop when we put them down on a tabletop. So I'm going to paint up the base here, and I'm going to do that with a very watery mix of heavy sienna. So the reason why I've thinned down this paint so much is that I want it to flow into all the cracks on this kind of dirt texture that I've worked in here. So in order to get into all those details, we use a very thin paint and we do a few layers of it. All right, so the next step for our bases here is to layer on some wash to kind of breathe a little life into those recesses, push some contrast into them. And I'm going to use a little bit of Vallejo model color wash, just this black wash. So the next step here is to do a little bit of a dry brush on these bases with some Cork brown. So the next step is to kind of catch the raised areas with some gray on these rocks to kind of give them a little bit more life. So the last color I'm going to be using is Bone White, and this is going to be a very, very light, very gradual dry brush to just put hot highlights on the very, very tops of all the dirt texture. All right, so the base is done. A very quick paint job on there. I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. And the last thing I want to do is kind of clean up the edges of the base, which are kind of dirty. I've done this in a few ways in the past, but the way that I've kind of settled on doing it, my favorite way, is to remove the paint with some isopropyl alcohol. So I've got a little dropper of isopropyl alcohol here, a little pipette, and I'm dishing it out into my wash tray, loading up a Q-tip, and then just literally, like magic, erasing the paint from the side. It takes about 2 passes to clean up a base. The first pass kind of loosens the paint and gets it kind of removed and mostly taken off, and the second pass cleans up the first pass. All right, so that's that first base all cleaned up. I'm going to do that for the other 2 bases, and we're going to go put this on the turntable and take a look at the final product. All right, well, that's all I've got for you for today. And if you're interested in seeing more videos, especially more Nighthaunt videos, I'm definitely going to be producing those in the near future. The next things up are either going to be hex race or chain rasps. Those are kind of things that I've decided to paint next. If you're interested in seeing me paint those, let me know in the comments. And if you have any general tips or advice for my process, any ideas that you can throw out, let me know. I'd love to hear them. Beyond that, hit me with a subscription. That'd be awesome. Like the video, and take it easy. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.